Washington just arrested Nicolas Maduro and his wife. They are calling it a victory for democracy. But I spent 8 years at the IMF watching how this game is played. This is not about justice. This is about control. And what they are not telling you is that the arrest of Maduro is actually the final move in a much older game, a game that has nothing to do with Venezuela and everything to do with the future of the dollar itself. You think this story ends with handcuffs in a courtroom, but the real story begins the moment those handcuffs close, because when an empire arrests a foreign leader, it is not enforcing the law. It is sending a message. You have been told that Maduro is a monster. But what if I told you that the United States needed Maduro to be exactly what he became? What if the chaos in Venezuela was not a failure of American policy, but the intended result? The headlines are celebrating. CNN is running victory laps. The State Department is issuing statements about the rule of law and human rights. But let me tell you something I learned in the hallways of the IMF. When Washington celebrates, you should start asking questions. So let us ask the uncomfortable question: why now? Maduro has been in power for over a decade. The United States declared him illegitimate in 2019. They imposed sanctions. They froze assets. They even recognized Juan Guaido as president, and yet Maduro survived. So what changed? The answer is not in Caracas. The answer is in Washington, and it has to do with oil, debt, and the slow-motion collapse of the petrodollar system. Let me take you back to 2022. The United States and Europe froze $300 billion of Russian reserves. They thought they were punishing Moscow, but what they actually did was send a signal to every oil-producing nation on earth. They said, your money is not safe. Saudi Arabia heard that message. China heard it, and Venezuela had already lived it. The United States had been seizing Venezuelan assets for years. They took Citgo, Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset, worth approximately $8 billion. They froze over $30 billion in central bank reserves and gold held in international banks. By 2023, Venezuela's foreign reserves had collapsed to just $1.2 billion, down from over $30 billion in 2012. They forced Caracas into a corner where the only way to survive was to stop using the dollar entirely. And that is exactly what Venezuela did. They started selling oil to China for yuan. By 2024, over 65% of Venezuela's oil exports were paid for in yuan, not dollars. They started accepting cryptocurrencies, particularly the petro, a state-backed digital currency. They became a laboratory for what a post-dollar oil economy might look like. And that terrified Washington. Now fast forward to today, the United States is facing a fiscal crisis. They need to borrow $3 trillion this year just to keep the lights on. The U.S. national debt now stands at $36.2 trillion as of January 2026. For the first time in history, annual interest payments on that debt exceed $1 trillion, more than the entire defense budget. But the buyers are disappearing. China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to just under $760 billion in 2025. Japan, traditionally the second largest holder, has been selling U.S. debt to defend the yen, which hit a 34-year low against the dollar in 2024. The only option left is for the Federal Reserve to print the money itself. But there is a problem. If you print trillions of dollars, you create inflation. So what do? You need to keep the dollar strong. You need to force the world to keep using it. And one of the oldest tricks is to control the oil supply. This is where Venezuela comes back into the picture. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, over 303 billion barrels, larger than Saudi Arabia's 297 billion and Russia's 80 billion. If the United States can control that oil, they can dictate the terms of the global energy market. But there was one problem: Maduro. For years, Washington tried to remove him quietly. They backed coups. They imposed crushing sanctions that, according to a UN report, contributed to the deaths of over 40,000 Venezuelans between 2017 and 2018 due to lack of access to medicine and food. The sanctions cut Venezuela's oil production from 2.4 million barrels per day in 2015 to under 700,000 by 2020. But Maduro held on, and the longer he held on, the more dangerous he became, not because of his ideology, but because he proved that you could defy Washington and survive. That is the unforgivable sin. So when diplomacy failed, when sanctions failed, they had to go to the final option: arrest. Now let us talk about how this arrest actually happened. We are told that Maduro and his wife were captured during a secret operation. But captured where? Venezuela is a sovereign nation. If Maduro was on Venezuelan soil, then this is not an arrest. It is an invasion. Unless, of course, he was not in Venezuela. There are reports that Maduro was lured out of the country, perhaps for a summit, perhaps for negotiations. And once he crossed the border, the trap closed. This is not new. The United States did this with Manuel Noriega in 1989, invading Panama to arrest him. They did it with Milosevic, pressuring Serbia until he was handed over. The playbook is old, but it works. But here is where it gets interesting. The arrest of Maduro does not solve Washington's problem. It may make it worse. Because Venezuela is a member of BRICS, it has deep ties to China, Russia, and Iran. Venezuela owes China over $60 billion in oil-backed loans. In 2024 alone, Venezuela shipped 480,000 barrels per day to China, accounting for nearly 70% of its total exports. But the relationship goes deeper than just oil and debt. China has invested over $50 billion in Venezuela's infrastructure, mining, and energy sectors since 2007. They built power plants, railways, and housing projects. They trained Venezuelan engineers and technicians. This was not charity. This was strategic positioning. China was buying influence in America's backyard, proving that you could challenge U.S. dominance in Latin America and survive. And Russia joined the game too. Moscow sold Venezuela over $11 billion in weapons systems between 2005 and 2017, including fighter jets, tanks, and S-300 missile defense systems. They conducted joint military exercises in the Caribbean, a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that declares Latin America as America's sphere of influence. So when Washington arrested Maduro, they were not just arresting a Venezuelan leader. They were sending a message to Beijing and Moscow: stay out of our hemisphere. But that message arrived too late, because China and Russia are already there, and they are not leaving. When the United States arrested Maduro, they sent a message to every leader in the Global South. The message is, we can reach you anywhere. But the Global South is learning that the only way to be safe is to build a system where Washington cannot reach you. This is why the BRICS payment system is accelerating. The M-Bridge project, developed by the central banks of China, Thailand, UAE, and Hong Kong, processed over $22 billion in cross-border transactions in 2024. This is why de-dollarization is intensifying. In 2024, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell to 58.4%, down from 73% in 2001. Because every time the United States uses its power to arrest a leader, it proves that the system is not neutral. It is a weapon. So what happens next? Legally, Maduro will be brought to trial in the United States. The media will cover it like a spectacle, and they will declare that justice has been served. But the real trial is happening in Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and Brasilia. The trial is this: can the global majority build an alternative system fast enough? Let me be clear, I do not defend Maduro as a person. Under his leadership, Venezuela's GDP contracted by 75%. Between 2013 and 2020, one of the largest economic collapses in modern history. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the second largest refugee crisis in the world after Syria. But I also do not accept the narrative that Washington is arresting him out of concern for human rights. If that were true, they would arrest leaders in Saudi Arabia, where journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered. They would arrest leaders in Egypt, where over 60,000 political prisoners are held. The difference is that those leaders cooperate with Washington. Maduro did not, and that is why he is in handcuffs today. The arrest of Maduro is not an isolated event. It is part of a pattern of escalation. First, they froze Russian reserves. Then they isolated China with tariffs. In 2024, the U.S. imposed tariffs averaging 25% on $500 billion worth of Chinese goods. Now they are arresting foreign leaders. Each step pushes the world closer to a breaking point, because the rest of the world is building alternatives. And the more Washington tightens its grip, the faster those alternatives develop. This is the paradox of hegemony. So here's my prediction. The arrest of Maduro will not stabilize Venezuela. It will destabilize it further. Remove him, and you create a power vacuum, and power vacuums are never filled peacefully. You will see more violence, more chaos, and eventually the United States will have to decide, occupy Venezuela or allow it to collapse. Either option is a disaster, but the real consequence is the signal this sends. When you arrest a foreign leader, you are saying that sovereignty is conditional, and once you cross that line, you give permission to everyone else to ignore international law. The rules-based order dies the moment Washington stops following the rules. The arrest of Maduro is not a sign of American strength. It is a sign of American desperation. Because when you have to arrest your enemies instead of outcompeting them, you have already lost. If you are watching from the United States, pay attention to the cost. The U.S. spends over $900 billion annually on defense, more than the next 9 countries combined. Yet its infrastructure is crumbling, ranked 13th globally by the World Economic Forum. Pay attention to the inflation, the debt, the crumbling infrastructure. If you are watching from the global south, understand that this is about the survival of a system that no longer serves humanity. If you are from Europe, ask yourself, do you want to be tied to a sinking ship? The story of Maduro's arrest is just beginning, and the question is, what happens to a world where the most powerful nation can arrest anyone, anywhere? The answer will define the next decade. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming with the fall of every empire that thought it could rule forever.